Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to try turning the light on. If you can't see it, I'll turn it back on. You guys tell me.
I can see it.
It wasn't me.
Right here in the front.
No.
That was a very apt title.
Do what?
Very apt title with the lights down.
Yeah. All right, well, welcome. How are you enjoying Drupal Camp so far?
Awesome.
Yeah. How many of you, this is your first Drupal Camp?
This is
Welcome. It's your
my
second.
Like, first
Welcome.
one
Welcome.
2010, so it's been a lot of years.
All righty. Well, I'm going a little bit off the Drupal island a bit with the web components. So this one is called Out of the Shadows and Into the Light. So how to make your custom web components reusable, which is inherent. Front-end developer friendly, not always inherent. SEO friendly and accessible. So I'm Lisa Ridley. I have been a long-time Drupal developer. I've been doing web development for about 18 years, almost all of it with Drupal. I have 32 years of project management experience, so I had a couple of careers before I got into web development. I am an Acquia certified Drupal 7 developer. I have not ever gotten my Drupal 8/9/10 certification. I am a certified Scrum Master and a certified product owner, and I'm also certified in human-centered design. Outside of doing web development, which I love, I am a Smack Talk and SEC football fan. I am a huge Tennessee Volunteers fan. I am a closet NASCAR fan. And I am a gardener and a beginning homesteader. So, and there in the bottom right corner is pictures of my little supervisors, Sassy and Daisy. They're actually, my football husband is babysitting for me. He sends me pictures every morning. So he sent me a picture this morning and said, "I'm in bed with a girl, ain't she sassy?" Showing you a picture of my little sassy pup. All right, so what are web components? Anybody want to answer that? When I'm talking about web components, I am talking about native web components. Okay. So web components are a standard, and it's a way to create reusable, encapsulated, modular HTML elements without using a JavaScript framework. So no React, no Vue, no Preact or any of those other frameworks that you can build components with. So what does that mean? Well, web components are a set of standards, and they are, as of, I think, the end of 2022, they are natively supported across all of the major browsers. So that is when web components have been around for a long time. They've been around since like 2014, I think was when the first standard came out. But because not all of the browsers supported it, it didn't really get a lot of traction until it started getting more broad support across the browsers. And now all of the major browsers do support web components. There's no IE support. And I think Opera is the only quasi-major browser that doesn't support web components broadly. All of the rest of them, Safari, Chrome, Firefox, there's a couple others that are considered major browsers that do support web components, and they've been supported now for a couple of versions. So they are starting to get some traction, and you are starting to see them. There's actually a Drupal firm that specializes in doing development for the health industry, so health insurance industry, health provider industry, that has built a web component framework that they utilize to build out their front-end pieces for their client sites. I learned this when I was working at my last employer, Vardot, where we picked up a support contract on a website that had been developed using this framework. First time I'd ever seen web components. And didn't pick up on what I was looking at until we got our hands kind of dirty with the code, and I'm like, started doing a little research, and I'm like, oh, then the light bulb started going off, and that's when I started learning about web components. So web components are a set of standards consistent across all the browsers. And they are actually composed of a set of 4 substandards that are all rolled up that make up the standard that is web components. And that is custom HTML templates, or elements, HTML templates, and we'll talk about what each one of these are. The thing that was new that got introduced with web components that kind of makes them work is the shadow DOM. And then ES modules. So ES6 modules, you can bundle everything in a web component up into a module that's called an ES module. You can then take that module and install it in different front-end frameworks or different front-end. You don't have to have a framework at all. You can just load the JavaScript and put it in the markup and use it that way. So custom HTML elements. Okay, that's an HTML element, i.e. a tag, whose behavior you can define using a combination of JavaScript, HTML templates, and styling. You can use most web components do use the shadow DOM feature. You do not have to use the shadow DOM to have a web component, but it's all encapsulated as an ES module. HTML templates is a way for you to bundle a set of HTML fragments, so not an entire HTML DOM tree, but maybe you want a div, and then inside the div you want to put certain elements inside the div, and you can bundle those into a template, so it's reusable. And then you can use it in one of 2 ways. You can either use it using JavaScript that you also bundle as part of the element, or you can use it immediately in the shadow DOM, and we'll talk about how you use that immediately in just a few minutes. So the HTML templates are useful for making those reusable structured markup templates that inherently become part of a web component. So what is the shadow DOM? Well, the shadow DOM is a hidden DOM tree. How many of you are familiar with JavaScript DOM tree? Okay, good. So when I talk about the shadow DOM is actually an encapsulated component of the DOM tree. And it is composed of the shadow host, which is your regular DOM, but the specific component node on the DOM host where the shadow DOM is attached. So we also refer to this when you're talking about web components as the light DOM. You have the shadow tree, which is the DOM tree inside your web component that you construct either with an HTML template or with JavaScript. You have the shadow root, which is the root node of the shadow tree. So that is where the shadow DOM is attached to the light DOM. And then you have the shadow boundary, which is the bounding box of everything that is contained within the shadow DOM and is part of the component. Have I given anybody any new information here, or is this all pretty well known? New? Okay. So, shadow DOM, is this friend or foe? Well, the community, you will, if you Google web components and shadow DOM, you will find all kinds of discussion on how it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's horrible. Why would you do this? What I have tended to find as I've done research on web components is that the horrible, I hate it, don't use it, this is awful, these folks tend to be your Vue developers, your React developers, so they're approaching it with the mindset of trying to build a Vue component or trying to build a React component, and they're trying to build web components in the same fashion. That is not the way you should approach a web component. The folks that are in the other camp that love it, think it's the best thing since sliced bread, those are the folks that don't typically use front-end frameworks. So what you can do with a web component is you can introduce some of those interactive components and that next level of complexity without having to resort to a framework. So if I just want to have a component on my website that I can reuse on multiple properties, and I want it to have some of that interactivity that you can get with a React or a Vue component, I can build it. I just don't have to add React or Vue to my project to be able to do that. So the shadow DOM can be a double-edged sword. So The reason is that the shadow DOM is encapsulated, which means that the HTML element in the shadow DOM can't be touched or influenced by what's ever outside of it. So the shadow DOM elements can have its own styling, and it doesn't affect anything outside of the HTML element. Consequently, the outside elements, your global styling, can be styled and not affect your element inside that's contained inside the shadow DOM. So what does that mean practically speaking? They can't be accidentally styled, and HTML element stylings won't mess with your global styles. So you can't style in the shadow DOM unless you set it up properly. Boy, I really messed up that one. Sorry. So you can't style the elements unless you build stylability into your web component. That wasn't finished there. So if you're building web components and you don't build those stylability features in, and we'll talk about how you can do that, you will drive your front-end developers insane, because they will be trying to style it and cannot figure out how if they're not familiar with how you use web components. Now, in terms of building web components so that you are leveraging the shadow DOM, you can do that in two ways. You can do it through JavaScript only. So everything is bundled or wrapped in JavaScript. Or you can do it declarative, where you can actually use your HTML tag, that is your web component, in your HTML markup, and then put things inside of it. And those things that's called using it declaratively. So you can put a template in your HTML. You can insert HTML elements inside of the template wrapped in your HTML. And then you can, through references and also through bundling the outer HTML component tag, building the JavaScript to turn that in, because you have to register a component with the DOM. So when you can do all of that as markup in the HTML. Now, the downside of that, the pro of that, is declarative markup styling is more accessible to front-end developers. The downside of that is declarative marking suddenly makes your markup a little bit more messy, because it is actually in the markup of your page. It is not in this separate template. The best way, the approach that seems to be emerging with web components is, the general trend is use the functionality of web components to progressively enhance your base markup. So build your base elements without the use of JavaScript. There's a couple of reasons why. Those will be server-side rendered. So that's going to be, because it's inherent in your markup, it's rendered without having to go through the browser in order to do so. Progressively make that element functional. Progressively enhance it with the JavaScript of the web component. The progressive enhancement and the construction of web components with JavaScript is client-side rendered. So that's going to take place in the browser. So when you build this base element, build your basic accessibility into your declarative shadow DOM. Now, what do I mean when I say that? When I say your basic accessibility, what does that mean to you?
Source ordering.
Sorry, what was that?
Source ordering properly.
Source ordering.
The order of your elements.
Source ordering is part of it. Also, making sure that what you build into the declarative shadow DOM is semantic HTML. So it's basically doing things. If you're a Drupal developer, a lot of the themes and templates that are base elements available in Drupal already have. There's been a lot of work to already build in your basic accessibility into those. So as a developer, as long as I'm starting with a good base theme, I usually don't have to focus a whole lot on accessibility. When you're building web components, it doesn't have anything to do with your Drupal theme. So you need to be a lot more conscious about what you do need to build in there. in order to make it accessible. And I'm focusing on accessibility because generally, if your markup is accessible, it's SEO friendly. That's the thing that building accessible websites kind of brings along with it. Now, is that 100%? No. I'd say it's about 85, 90%. If you've got an accessible website, you're not going to have to do a whole lot of enhancements to it to make it SEO friendly. So shadow DOM encapsulation can be penetrated with styling. First thing you need to do when you are declaring your shadow DOM for your web component is you need to open it. So you can actually declare your shadow DOM for your web component to either be open or closed. If it is closed, it is completely encapsulated and it is not visible and it is not penetratable outside of the web component itself. If you open a browser console and you try to access that web component, it's not going to be found. So you do have to declare it as open. The key thing here, there's basic styling that you can apply, but it's usually limited to text field styling. So you can style the font, you can style the color. That's about it. Unless you specifically build your web components where they have style elements that you can touch. So one of the easiest ways to do that is to leverage some of the newer features of CSS. So leverage your CSS variables, leverage pseudo elements, and we'll talk about some of those that can be easily leveraged in just a minute. That will allow being able to style the part of the DOM that's inside the web component a lot more easy and a lot more effectively using your global style sheets. So for accessibility, we touched on this. The same standard web rules apply. If your custom web element is an interactive control, make sure it's focusable, keyboard accessible, leverages styles for focus, hover, and active states. So all of those things that typically, if you're working with a Drupal theme, those are kind of all inherently built in unless you do something that overrides them. But if you are building web components in isolation to use in a Drupal theme, you're going to have to put these things in your web components. One of the things that you can use within your web components, especially if it's an interactive component where maybe you've built in an event listener into your web component so that you can toggle states on and off. Make sure that you use your ARIA labels. So when you toggle to make it visible, make sure that you apply the appropriate ARIA labels so that those assistive technologies understand the state change that happened with the web component and they can announce it to the users. And also, you want to make sure that you've and I thought I touched on this on the previous slide, but maybe I didn't. Make sure that you put your tab indexes, make sure they're keyboard and tab accessible. So if you need tab indexes on them, put those on there. Leverage the ARIA states on web components. This is especially important with a web component because as the screen reader's running across it, it may not pick up on the fact that this web component extends across multiple lines, or it's a component that needs to be expanded or collapsed. So if you collapse, for example, one of the best use cases I can think of for a web component is accordions. So like for fact pages, building an accordion that opens and closes. So if you do that and you're just opening it and closing it, because it is inside the shadow DOM, those screen readers may not pick up on the fact that you've changed the state on the web component. So use your ARIA labels on there. Don't just change the class that opens it or closes it. Also use your ARIA labels. The other thing that you can do as part of the and how many Drupal developers do we have in here? How many of you have been playing with single directory components? Okay. So, part ring a bell with single directory components when you're defining it? Do what?
No, I haven't used that one.
You haven't used that one? Okay. So, how about slots? Does that ring a bell? Slots and parts? Okay, so remember we were talking about the declarative DOM and the HTML that you're putting inside of your web component? You can also declare that markup as slots. A lot of the single directory components for Drupal leverage some of the standards that web components use. So the declarative DOM, the shadow DOM. So the slots and parts that are part of single directory components is working with the shadow DOM. It just doesn't use all of them. So leveraging the part pseudo class can allow you to target your global CSS to specific elements inside your web component. It's best used for dynamically applied styling. So if you need to change the state of an element based on a click or a tab, you can put an event listener inside your web component, and then when you tab into it or you click on it, that event listener triggers a class change. Well, you can also use the pseudo class attribute and trigger not only a class change but the pseudo attribute change, and you can have style rules in your global style sheet that will then affect the styling of that element once you've made that change. So all of that sounds complex. Sounds like a lot of work, a lot of awareness that you have to have in order to effectively utilize web components. Can anyone, I'm going to stop for just a minute because I'm asking you a question. Why use web components?
It's native. There's no overhead.
Well, that's one reason.
It's independent of frameworks or platforms.
It's independent of frameworks or platforms. That right there is key. So if you are just working on a Drupal site, would that be a good use case for web components or not? Probably not. Probably if you are just working on Drupal sites, you're using twig-based templating, some of the Drupal standard-based themes that support single directory components, probably wouldn't want to add the overhead, and because I will tell you that having worked on projects that were built around web components, it does take more concerted effort to maintain the web components. If I were doing a single site and I wanted some sort of component interactivity, some sort of reusability, I probably would not use web components. But if I were working on Drupal and WordPress and Adobe Experience Manager, and then I had a team over here that was building web apps, I would seriously consider, and branding and consistency is important. I would seriously consider building a web component framework that can be reused on all of those platforms. Because it's natively supported in the browser, you can very easily drop it in as part of your Vue library, drop it in as part of your React library, drop it into Adobe Experience Manager, drop it into your WordPress templates, load the library as part of your WordPress templates. And when you do that, all of those web components will then behave the same on all of those platforms. You can make them look the same, you can make them act the same. So if you've got, where the popularity of web components is coming in is on, there's a lot of use of web components at the enterprise level, where there are multiple platforms that have to be supported. And there are multiple teams that are working within the company, and they all have to apply consistent branding and styling guidelines. They will have a dedicated team that does nothing but build and maintain the web components library for these other teams to use in their different platforms. And that's where I touched on that. I'm going to make these slides. I'm going to fix the typos in the slides, but I haven't uploaded them yet. But I will fix the typos in there and upload it and make these available. Because what I'm also including at the end, for those that have never worked with web components before or are new at it, I've got some nice resources at the end for learning more about how to use web components. So for more information, I've got links that will be in the slides to the developer docs. There's a couple of really good YouTube series here on getting you started with web components. I like Steve Griffiths as the starter, but Chris Ferdinandi has done a lot of work, and he kind of raises, I actually got this backward when I was first doing research. I did Chris Ferdinandi's series and then I did Steve Griffith's series. Steve's is a better one to start with, and then Chris will teach you on why, take what Steve teaches you and think about things a little bit differently and why you should consider doing them in a different way. So you basically get a foundation and then a what if. The Lion framework is one that I'm going to bring up because this was actually developed by ING and they open sourced it. So you can white label, you can use their white label components. So it is basically a whole book of web components that have little to no native styling on them. So they're fairly raw, but they are built with accessibility in mind and stylability in mind. So if you want to get started with web components and you don't want to start with them from scratch, you might take a look at the Lion framework, which is a set of components very well built that you can then apply your own styling to and modifications and kind of build from something that someone else has already started with. The Lion framework is built on the Lit framework. How many of you have heard of Lit? Okay, this is a Google project, then they spun it off, open sourced it. They don't support it anymore, but it does have pretty good support. I think the last time I checked the Lit framework GitHub repository, it was updated about 3 months ago. So it does seem to be maintained. There's not a lot of maintenance that has to be done on it right now, and there won't be until there's more emerging standards around web components, which there's a lot of them that are under development. Another set of videos that are good to watch are the ones by Skill Bakery. These are all on YouTube. I would watch the Skill Bakery ones last. I would start with Steve Griffiths as the beginner guy, and then check out Chris Ferdinandi. He's also got a blog, and he's got a series you can subscribe to for a nominal fee every month. He does a really good job. He does a lot of work with larger enterprise clients. He's done a lot of work. NASA's one of his clients that he's built web component frameworks for. All right. So that's what I have. Questions, comments?
How you access styling from the outside?
How do you access styling from the outside? Well, we talked about a few of those elements. So let me pull up one. Hang on just a minute. Let me see if I can find one and pull it up. We'll put it up on screen. I'm gonna turn off screen mirroring for just a minute while I poke around and find what I'm looking for. Let's see here. That wasn't the one I was looking for either. We'll see if we can take a look at a couple of the Lit framework components. Can you all see that? Do I need to turn the light off to make that a little bit more visible? Can we cut the light? Okay, so this web component is a very simple web component. I'm going to run through the elements of it here. So basically, what we're doing at the top is we're importing the lit framework, or importing elements of the lit framework that we're going to use in this component. And then we're importing the lit decorators. By defining, this right here takes care of, in the lit framework, this line right here takes care of registering your web component. So basically, simple greeting is your HTML tag that you would insert in your HTML template to use this web component. It's got some styling. Looks like we're styling some P tags. We're styling them as blue. We have a property that we are calling somebody. So if you load the web greeting without a name attribute, it's going to say, hello somebody. If you add an attribute into the web component here, it's going to say hello world. So the way that you would style this is, let me take a look at this for a minute. This one may not be scope style. Let's see here. Yeah. So that one is, this particular element, this is one that's an example element. This one right here cannot be styled from outside of the element. So in order to style this, you would need to define the static styles a little bit differently, or not define a static style inside the element at all. But instead provide in your HTML markup. So right here, provide a part tag. And then on that part tag, add give it a name. So part equals greeting. And then from outside, in your global style sheet, you can do a style rule that targets the simple greeting tag that has the part equal to A greeting or B greeting. Or you could use a color name. So you could put a part attribute on there and make the part attribute equal to pink. And then you could write your style rule to be simple greetings part, pink in the parentheses since it's a pseudo element, and then apply your style rule to that style element, and then you could change the color. Without doing that, if you're doing the styling, up here is a static style inside of the web component, you will not be able to override the color equals blue. Now, the other way that we could do this is we could make the color a variable inside the element and provide the default color as blue, and then from outside you could change the variable color on the element and be able to change the color of it that way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Good. Any other questions? How many folks in here support sites on multiple platforms? No one? Everyone just works with Drupal?
Sort of do, but lately I've been so busy with Drupal that other people are taking care of the Windows platform. We have a team of developers, and most of them actually do .NET.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, see, all of this would work in the native web components will work just fine in a .NET framework as well.
yeah.
I've seen certain clients will have multiple different teams, and each team has their own platform, and they're doing their own thing. And then a new CTO shows up and it's like, we need to get everybody to look the same.
Yep.
And so then web components ends up being the useful thing there. But then you have teams that's like, well, we don't know web components, so we're not going to use it.
Well, and that if you've got a team, if you've got that situation where you're using multiple platforms, maybe you work for a large organization, and so you've got a team over here that's doing app development. You've got this team over here is doing internal development on the internet, and they're using Adobe Experience Manager. And this team over here is using Next.js to do the external website. They can all use those web components. And so typically what happens is the enterprise at the enterprise level, they'll have a team that does nothing but work on the web components library, and then they also write the instruction booklet that says to use this web component, put this element in the HTML markup, make sure it has these attributes, make sure that you can change these attributes with JavaScript in order to make it do this or make it do that, and document. So the key there is building your web components, making sure that the team that's building and maintaining the web components maintains the accessibility, maintains the SEO friendliness of it, builds all of those things in that needs to be there, tests them to make sure that they work, and then writes the documentation. And that documentation is written and maintained, and it's accessible by any of the other teams that have to maintain the web apps, or maintain the intranet, or maintain the external website, or maintain the commerce platform as opposed to the information website. They can all just leverage the same components, and they will all have the same look and feel. They can all be styled the same way, and they don't have to understand how the web components work.
Can you make web components work with SAS?
Yes.
I'm looking, how does that?
So the way you would not build SAS inside your web component. So if you put styling inside the web component, you're better off just using your native standard CSS, which, quite frankly, with some of the new emerging standards, I wouldn't be surprised if in 5 years we're no longer using SAS, because you can do the nesting now. Which is the one thing that SAS kind of brought to the table. That you could do, so you didn't have to declare 15 different elements to select on. You can now nest them with just native CSS. You didn't used to be able to do that. So that's what SAS brought to the table. But if you are still working with SAS, you can still build your global style sheets with SAS. You just need to put your selectors in there just like you would the selector for any other element.
Okay.
But the web component needs to be structured so that those selectors can be accessed from the global style sheet, which is going through some of the things that I talked about in terms of building in the pseudo elements and making sure that your shadow DOM is open.
Okay.
Other questions? Comments?
Yeah, follow up on that last question. So can't you have use SAS and then compile the web component into native CSS and then use that one instead?
You could do that. I'm not sure. I've not built a component that had so much styling built into the component itself that I had a need to do that. Because I've typically tried to put just the minimum level of styling inside my component and just make sure that it is structured so that the markup that it produces can be styled from the outside. But there's nothing that would prevent you from using a SAS compiler. Now, the thing that you want to make sure that you do is that if you want to encapsulate the styling for the component within the component, then you don't necessarily want to aggregate all of those style sheets. You want to leave your style sheet with the component. So you might want to turn off, make sure that you're building and compiling your individual style sheets as opposed to building and compiling one great big style sheet. And unless you make sure that those elements that you need to style with those style rules are exposed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How many folks in here are still using SAS?
Using what?
SAS.
SAS, we migrated to Post CSS and those.
I'm trying to move towards CSS native.
Yeah, it's a lot of similarities. It is a little bit of a transition. You can do it because SAS will compile native CSS as well. You can do it in stages to kind of just start. Maybe take one of those SAS style sheets, break it down, make it a native CSS sheet, replace it that way, and then just kind of work your way through.
Yeah.
If I were building a theme from scratch today, I probably wouldn't use SAS. I'd probably stick with native CSS.
Yeah.
Because of all of the features and flexibility that it brings. If I were working with a project that already had Sass in there, I'd probably continue to use it.
Yeah.
And maybe just use targeted native CSS for those things that I want to style within the element itself. What's more important though with the element, more important than the CSS styling, is the markup. So being able to build the event listeners, being able to change the attributes, and then as long as you've got your DOM open and you structure your markup appropriately, you can target it and style it using your global style sheet.
Makes sense.
Having worked with some elements that some of them were built and didn't have the DOM open, or had the DOM open but the elements weren't structured so that they could be targeted, I spent, the first time I had on the project that I picked up as a support client, the first time that the client asked us to make a change to some functionality on the site that affected one of the elements there that used web components, they actually asked us to do some customizations to their alert system. So there was an alert system built on the website that put banner alerts on pages. And they wanted to add the functionality where they could change the banner alert based on the page. There's Drupal modules out there that'll do that for you. Took me about a day to put the Drupal module in to do the custom alerts per page. Took me 2 weeks to deconstruct and rebuild the web components once I figured out why can't I affect and change this? And then when I started researching and found out, okay, it's because they're styled independently and they can't be styled. Then I had to deconstruct the web components and learn how to change the markup for them so that I could open them up on the DOM and be able to style them using the markup that was being generated by the Drupal modules. And then this particular project, the elements where the alerts were appearing actually impacted it had a floating dynamic menu. And the spacing and where the floating dynamic menu was, all of that was built with web components. So the menu was a web component, the alert was a web component, the main horizontal navigation bar was a web component, so the header was a web component. All of those were web components, and the floating menu was loading all of those web components, calculating the spacing to determine where to place the floating menu on the page. Took us forever to find all of the pieces that we had to take into consideration so that we could just change the alert banner to use a different background mechanism.
Was there a good reason there was that many web components?
That is, in retrospect, looking at, we inherited that project. So we got a support contract and it was already built when we got it. My opinion is that the company that built that site with web components did them a disservice, because that's the only property they had that was built with web components.
Okay.
And it just increased the complexity of having to maintain that project.
It's not just like, I was like, they just learned about web components.
Drupal CCC.
So that's why I said, if you are just maintaining one property or you're working with one framework, I don't know that I would go down the road of building a library with web components. But if you need to be able to have consistent look and feel across your apps, you're supporting 2 or 3 different frameworks. Maybe you're using Adobe Experience Manager and you're using a .NET framework, and you need that branding to be consistent, and you need that look and feel and that interactivity to be consistent regardless of, you need all that to be framework agnostic. Web components is a really good fit for that.
Would you then call it the modern iframe?
Yes, it behaves very much like an iframe.
Yeah.
You know how you can affect some of the styling on an iframe, but the iframe's got, what's in the iframe has got to be structured so that you can affect it. Think of web components as something very similar. So you have to consciously make it stylable from the outside in order for you to be able to work with it effectively. Because I know one of the hardest things every time I see something inside of a iframe, the very first question I ask is, can we access the framed component so that we can change the markup if we need to?
How do web components affect the critical render path?
I'm going to ask you to expand on when you say the critical render path.
Right, so we have to register with the DOM, right?
Mm-hmm.
So performance-wise,
Yeah.
how does it affect?
Okay,
loading
so
of the page?
that is where you have to, when you're building a complex web component, that is where mixing in your declarative DOM becomes a little bit more important, because declarative DOM is server-side rendered. If it's JavaScript built DOM, it's client-side rendered. So if you're shoving a whole lot of stuff in a component and you're doing it all with JavaScript, you are going to affect your performance a little bit in the rendering of that. But if you can build it declaratively, where you do your markup so that it's built server-side before it ever reaches the browser, then you can reserve the JavaScript built DOM. The JavaScript built changes to your declarative DOM can happen on client side, and it'll render a lot faster.
So do you just basically want to put everything that will not be dynamically changed at some point in the declarative?
Depending on the size of it. So if you're just structuring a couple of lines, just put it inside the web component itself. If you're building something that might have 35 or 40 lines of markup in there, I would seriously look at using the declarative DOM for that.
When you're talking about using the declarative DOM with dynamic elements, like you gave that accordion example earlier,
Right.
Does that mean you would model the different states of the component declaratively? So like would you like declare the closed state and the open state of the accordion, and then only use JavaScript to move between those two states?
Yes.
Okay.
So in that instance, it would be just like any other accordion that you would build.
Right, as opposed to manipulating the accordion directly with JavaScript.
Yes.
Okay.
I would just put a class on there for open and closed state, have style rule attached to that, and then I would just use the JavaScript inside the web component to toggle between the states.
Sure.
And you can build your rules in there to basically customize the accordion so that if you want only one element at a time open, make sure everything else is closed. You can put all of that inside your web component, and then you don't have to worry about making sure that your front-end developer knows what they have to put in the markup when they're using that tag for the accordion. They just know that they need to write an H2 header and a paragraph, with the H2 header being the clickable part of the accordion element and the paragraph tag being the contents, and that it all needs to be wrapped in an accordion element tag, if that's what you call it. And then you can build all those customizations in your JavaScript inside the element, and your front-end developer doesn't have to worry about that. They just have to know that they need to drop it in there, and that this is what can be styled.
Gotcha. Okay.
And I'm talking about your front-end developer thinking about working with a team where you're on the team that maintains the web components, and you've got another front-end developer that's going to be using the web components, and they're going to style them, and they're going to insert them in the page templates. So not trying to say that front-end developers don't know how to work with web components, but they may not have the expertise if you're concentrating that in a team.
Sure.
Any other questions? We went through a lot of information. A lot of it was conceptual, and I didn't do a lot of code examples simply because of the time allowed for presenting. Was this helpful at all? Okay, awesome. Well, I hope that the resources that I compiled and put at the end, which will be on the slides, I'll get, like I said, I'll fix those few typos in the slides and then upload them before the conference is over, so you all will be able to have them to download and follow along. I hope you find those resources helpful. Also, you can reach out and contact me. I'm a longtime member of the Drupal community. I am in Drupal Slack, Lisa Ridley. I am also on Drupal.org. I think I'm about to change my name back to my maiden name, so you may see me go from Ridley to Harrison. But if you do LH Ridley, it will redirect to my new username on Drupal.org. So I'm findable, and then you can always email me, and I'll stick this on the last slide when I upload them. You can also email me at my a long-standing domain name that I've had, codementality.com. So you can email me at lisa@codementality.com. Might take me a day or two to get back to you because I don't always check it every day, but I'm reachable. So and happy to answer any questions that you might have. If you want to get started with web components and you don't quite know how to get started, happy to help you with that. And anything else? All right. Well, we're